Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Welcome to today's Normal Behavioral Change talk. My name is Angela Jiang Wang, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm a new postdoctoral fellow at the Center of Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics at the University of Pennsylvania. And moving to today's agenda, we have today two very compelling talks for you, starting with a brief talk by an early career researcher, Jacob Glassman from Boston College, followed by the main talk from Folco Panizza from IMT School for Advanced Studies, Lucca. After these talks, we will have a brief Q&A segment open to all participants towards the end of today's session. So for anyone who might be new to this series, the NoBeC talks are organized by the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics here at Penn, with the support of the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program, and in partnership with the Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences program. And the center itself is a research center which provides specialized consulting, research, and training services to organizations throughout the world seeking to enact positive behavioral change. So here you can see the schedule of NoBeC talks for the rest of the year. We have two very exciting talks. In November, we have Lisa Spantic, and in December, we will have Greg Sparkman. And you can visit our website to register for these future talks, or you can scan the QR code right here. So lastly, before we turn to our speakers, please just note a few ground rules. So once you join, you should be automatically muted, but if you are not, please kindly mute yourself. And then if possible, please keep your camera on so we can have a more interactive discussion today. Then if you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat at any time, or you can also raise your hand at the end of the talks. And finally, the recording of the sessions will be uploaded to our website, which you have the link here, and they will also be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So our first presentation today is by an early career researcher, Jacob Glassman. Jacob is a fourth-year PhD student and NSF Graduate Research Fellow in the Cooperation Lab at Boston College. He graduated summa cum laude from the University of Maryland with degrees in psychology, philosophy, and a minor in statistics. Jacob's research broadly explores how children and adults think about and engage in intergroup conflict resolution. Collaborating with researchers across 4 continents, his current work investigates intergroup conflict resolution strategies, developing conceptions of multi-generational group conflict in resolution, and how parent socio-political attitudes and parenting beliefs shape children's conflict resolution expectations. Through this work, Jacob aims to identify the processes that foster constructive intergroup relations and to generate knowledge that informs real-world conflict resolution. So, Jacob's presentation today is on developing hope, how children and adults conceptualize intergroup conflict resolution. Before we move to the talk, I just wanted to quickly remind you that if you have any questions coming up as he presents, please feel free to put them in the chat. And because of the limited time, if you'd like, you can also leave your email in the chat so Jacob can also write to you to answer your questions. So now I stop sharing my screen, you can take the lead, Jacob.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that very warm introduction, and I'm very honored to be here today. I'm excited to share this research with you. This is the first time this research is going to be shared publicly, so I'm very excited that I get to share it with you. So give me one sec while I share my screen. Okay. So my talk today is on developing hope, how children and adults conceptualize intergroup conflict resolution. And as Angela said, I'm interested in how children, adolescents, and adults think about and contribute to resolving these large-scale intergroup conflicts. And today I'm going to be sharing data from a large multi-site project. I'm only showing the US data today, but we're collecting data in the US, Northern Ireland, Israel, and New Zealand across different levels of conflict to see how children, adults, and adults think about conflict resolution differently across conflict contexts. Okay. So I don't think I need to convince anyone that intergroup conflict is a problem. If you take a look at the news, you see evidence of different forms of conflicts, whether they are ethnic, political, racial conflicts around the world. And when we think about kids in these conflicts, typically we think of them as victims. We think about the different ways that children are impacted by conflict. But many of these conflicts have a multi-generational component to them, and many have started many generations ago. And the only way that these conflicts are able to continue is because children perpetuate them. They learn and are socialized to perpetuate them. And there's some very nice work in the developmental literature establishing that. But children are not only perpetuators of conflict, which there's been a good amount of research on. Less research has explored how children can be agents of change and how they could potentially contribute to resolving intergroup conflict. So my research aims to fill the gap. There's a lot of research on how children perpetuate intergroup conflict to focus on what is the bad, what happens, how does it happen, and how can we intervene to prevent and stop the bad. And then there's less research on the good. How do we understand what we can replace negative attitudes and behaviors in childhood with? So that's what my research is coming to contribute. So with that said, today we're going to be asking two main questions. One is, do children and adults distinguish between recent and multi-generational conflicts? And does that shape their approach to conflict resolution? And this is the study that we're running around the world. So these are the US participants. We interviewed them over Zoom. These are 127 to 12-year-olds. And we also gave the same stimuli to adults on Prolific. And our design has two within subject conditions, a recent conflict versus a multi-generational conflict. And I'm going to show you the stimuli. So we can't give a standard survey to children because they can't consistently read. So what we do is we come up with fun, engaging stories and then ask them questions about the stories. So I'm just going to go through an example of what children and the adults in this study would see. So welcome to Mushroom Town. In Mushroom Town, there are two groups of people, Fungarians and Portobarians. These are some Fungarians, here's some Portobarians. Mushroom Town does not have a lot of food, and the only place to get food is from this big mushroom patch. A long, long time ago, both groups promised to share the mushrooms. They agreed to only take 3 baskets of mushrooms each so that the mushroom patch did not run out of mushrooms. And so this is the multi-generational condition. But they took more and they violated the agreement, and there were fewer mushrooms, and they got angry at each other, and then they had kids, and they took even more mushrooms, and the resource is getting depleted, and now it's depleted, and they're really angry with each other, and then those kids have kids, and they take even more mushrooms, and now the resource is really depleted, and they're all very upset with each other. They don't like each other, they're angry, and they haven't spent time together for many, many years. They blame the other side for starting the fighting, and it's been going on for many, many years. An example in the recent conflict condition, it's an identical story, except you don't have the multiple iterations of having kids. We just say for a few weeks now, the groups have not spent time together or worked together. But the scale is the same. It's a society-wide conflict. And then we asked a bunch of different questions about conflict resolution. We asked about the conflict resolution difficulty, how hard would it be to resolve the conflict, how long would it take? We asked about perceptions of intractability. So how likely is it that the conflict will be transmitted to the next generation? Would two people from different groups get along with each other? Would a 5-year-old know about the conflict? And how important would it be for an immigrant to know about the conflict? And then we also asked importantly, about their future expectations. How optimistic are they about the potential for resolving conflict? Do they expect trust in the future? And if they were involved in the conflict, what would they do? So here's just here are examples of our DVs. This is the conflict resolution difficulty, and they're all on 1 to 6 scales. For kids, we asked all questions first as a binary and then gave them the 3-point scale corresponding to the valence they chose. And they're all pretty much the same. How long do you think it would take? How much time do you think it would take? These Fungarians had some Fungarian kids, and these Portobarians have some Portobarian kids. How likely do you think it is their kids will grow up to fight with each other? And so you get the idea. Interpersonal, what a 5-year-old know about the conflict? How important is it for an immigrant from Starland to know about the conflict? And optimism, trust, and action. Okay, so here are some results. These are going to be the effects for all the variables on the x-axis here, and the rating, everything's on a 6-point scale on the y-axis. And it's going to be broken down by age group. So there are no condition differences yet here. So for conflict resolution difficulty and length, we see that both children and adults think that both conflicts will be hard to resolve. There's no difference there between kids and adults. We do start to see differences, though, when we look at perceptions of intractability. So adults think that the conflict across conditions is more likely to be transmitted to the next generation than children do, although they both believe that it will be transmitted. In terms of expectations of interpersonal behavior, adults think it's less likely that the two people will get along with each other than children. And whether or not 5-year-olds know about the conflict, you see it's a similar direction, but it's not a statistically significant difference. And adults think it's more important for an immigrant to know about the conflict than children do. However, and I think importantly, children are more optimistic about conflict resolution in these contexts than adults are, providing evidence that maybe intervening from a young age might be an especially impactful way to resolve these conflicts. And I think this also demonstrates that children from a very young age, age 7, have a pretty mature, robust conception of intergroup conflict and how they think about resolving intergroup conflict. And then interestingly, there's no difference, again, across conditions here in how children and adults say they would act to resolve conflict. Okay, so now breaking it down by condition. For children and adults, they both think that it will be harder to resolve conflict in the multi-generational condition than the recent condition. And these differences, this effect for adults is larger than it is for children. We see the same results here for transmission and behavior, that children and adults expect more transmission in the multi-generational condition as opposed to the recent condition. And children did not perceive differences, but for the child and immigrant question, but adults did. So we have slightly diverging and more mature, developed understanding of multi-generational conflicts for adults here. So you see this kind of emerging perception. And children expect less trust in the multi-generational condition, as do adults, and there's no effect size difference there, although it is trending. But interestingly, for adults and children, in terms of if they would act to resolve the conflict, children, there's no statistically significant difference, but for adults, there is. So children don't necessarily see a difference between the recent multi-generational conflicts in terms of how they would act to resolve the conflict, whereas adults say that they would be less likely. Importantly, and I think encouragingly, at least from this third person perspective, both children and adults say that they would try to do something in this context. Whether or not they would actually do something in real life is a different question. But at least the attitudes and expectations here are positive. And there's no effect size difference. Yeah, okay. So additionally, I ran a latent profile analysis exploratorily. And the best fit came back with 3 groups. And that's what I'm going to show you. So here on the x-axis, again, we have all the variables in the same order, the rating on 1 to 6, broken down by children and adults, and then broken down by our 3 groups. So what we see here, this pattern, is what we're thinking of as a realist pattern. So people, children and adults, think it will be hard to resolve the conflict. They expect degree of transmission. They think that the behavior won't be super positive, but they say that they are optimistic and they expect trust and they would do something. So they think resolving conflict is hard, but they're still going to try to do something about it. Then we look at the optimists. They think conflict resolution is going to be a lot easier. Not super duper easy, but pretty easy relative to the realists. And they also say that they would act to resolve conflict. They expect trust. They're optimistic. In contrast, the pessimists, they think it's going to be very hard to resolve conflict, and they are very pessimistic about this. They're a lot less likely to say that they would try to do something or expect trust in the future. They think the conflict will definitely be transmitted, as opposed to this kind of neutral level of transmission here. So taken together, we have evidence that children from a very young age have a conception of multi-generational and recent intergroup conflict, and they understand the differences, and that impacts their approach to resolving these conflicts. We also have evidence that adults have a more mature understanding, even though children have a pretty developed understanding, and that with age, it seems like adults become more pessimistic than children are. I haven't run this test yet, the chi-squared here, but it does seem like the majority of kids here are optimists, whereas we see people going from the optimists over here more to the pessimists, as opposed to the realists. So all in all, intervening in childhood, I think, is a really important and necessary intervention for the resolution of these large-scale, especially multi-generational intergroup conflicts. And I would advocate that a lot of resources be poured into this because If we're only thinking in terms of short-term election cycles, then we're missing a huge part of the picture when many of these conflicts are shaped by decades of social, political, economic conditions. So in addition to thinking the short term, in addition to thinking in terms of election cycles, I advocate that we also think in terms of generations. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jacob, for your presentation. So we have 1 minute, so maybe take 1 or 2 questions for Jacob if anyone wants to raise their hand. Otherwise, we will move on. Okay, Folco, I see you raise your hand, so please go on.
How is this topic? No, it's a great talk. Don't have like
Thank you.
a short question now.
Okay, if anyone else has a question, please raise your hand. Otherwise, you can leave them in the chat also or ask them at the Q&A at the end. Okay, then I think we can move on. So let me share my screen again. Okay. Okay. So today's main talk will be by Dr. Folco Panizza. Just to give you a brief introduction, Dr. Panizza's interdisciplinary research explores how social norms and incentives influence decision-making processes and misinformation dynamics in digital environments. His recent work examines the coexistence of competing norms as a driver of political polarization, the effect of behavioral and monetary incentives on recognizing scientific information, and designing scalable digital interventions that encourage prosocial behavior and constructive discourse. Folco's talk today is on norm multiplicity, how and when multiple norms coexist. So, Folco, I will stop sharing my screen now so you can begin sharing your presentation if you'd like. And thank you again so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Angela, and thank you, Jacob, for the great talk. Actually, this is a very nice. It dovetails very nicely with what I'm about to talk. But first, just to keep the tension high, I just have a little quiz for you. Can you see the screen? I hope. And so I'm asking, like, I'm just presenting you this scenario, and I will read to you. And if you feel like commenting with what would you be your evaluation of the scenario on the chat, be much appreciated. So an old colleague is retiring. The office decides to buy show tickets as a living gift and agrees to split the cost evenly. Sorry, I just got a call, so apologies in advance also for my that would be a bit of an issue, but hopefully not too much. So when it comes time to contribute, however, one colleague pays twice the agreed amount. Is this action appropriate, inappropriate, or neither? I can't see the chat, but I hopefully will get to see some responses. Okay, I see you're shy. That's okay. Like, well, okay. Well, we'll get to see some responses. That's great. Now, the point of this little as answers come by, the point of this little scenario that I'm just presenting to you is to make a point that even in mostly innocuous scenarios and where things are generally there's no conflict, you can still feel can be a lot of disagreement in terms of what is the right thing to do. Now, this may come to problem of personal preferences sometimes, but I would argue that most of this agreement, and I see also people who like to raise the point that it really depends, right? Is because there are underlying normative principles that clash with each other, and that's true as much as it's true in like small cases like this. If you think about any sort of like workplace norms. If you have ever had a white collar job, you may just be wondering what the hell is a business casual attire, right? There's a lot of disagreement what's appropriate dress in the workplace, right? So it could be innocuous, but it could also raise a lot of issues, especially when different people feel very strongly about their moral principles, the normative principles. So that's what I'm willing to talk about today, and try to give you an overview of this concept that I call norm multiplicity. And so the idea that we can have different normative principles existing in the same environment, and these normative principles do not necessarily blend in well. There's some sort of disagreement. And let me start by giving you a few definitions, just to make things a bit clearer what I mean. So by normative, like multiplicity, I mean that there's a coexistence of normative views within some group that are to some extent incompatible. I mean, the most common case you might have experienced, it's like having to comply to different norms in different contexts. The same person has to comply with different rules within the family, or with friends, or with colleagues. But another type of multiplicity, which is a bit more harder to grasp in a way, is when different individuals share the same context and same spaces, and they're complying to different normative principles. And when I'm talking about this kind of situation, I'm not saying that there is not there is no single moral principle that is just vaguely interpreted by different people. It's actually different ones. So it's not like a simple norm that is loose enough to accommodate different normative views, but it's actually there's kind of a disagreement, and people will call you out if you don't follow their rules. You can think of like neighborly relations, another example comes forward. And another important distinction is that when there's norm multiplicity, it doesn't mean there's no norms. It's that norms are enforced, but their strength of enforcement depends on like how much you are enclosed within a group. And to some extent, even if there's norm multiplicity, there is disagreement, but for some actions, different subgroups may still agree that something is utterly wrong. And there's multiple reasons why we could see norms, like multiple norms could exist. Of course, there could be group dynamics that create or try to erase this multiplicity. So you can think of like horizontal pressure by coexisting groups, intercultural relations, as it said, like having to abide by different norms in different settings. But there could be also vertical pressures, especially when there's larger groups, majoritarians, trying to somewhat integrate and reduce the influence of norms by minoritarian groups. So sort of like vertical influences. At the same time, we can think that multiplicity can arise from uncertainty. And this, like we have plenty of examples recently, like something like ChatGPT has revolutionized the way we deal with a lot of chores and also academic work, as everyone probably has experienced firsthand. But it's also hard to, when this kind of technology breaks through, it's hard to have an evaluation whether it's good or bad, what are the good things of it, what are bad things, how people will look at me if I do use these kind of tools. And then cultural shifts, political transitions, all sorts of new like situation contexts that we are just crossing in, like think about the pandemic, for instance. And another important source of multiplicity is like our lack of knowledge, right? If we end up like within a new group, like for instance, you enter a conference and you don't know what are other people's stances on a specific theory. What are like other people's opinions? There's uncertainty involved in the fact that I don't know exactly what a situation is. There could be disagreements, there could be actual agreements. Frankly, I think also moral dilemmas fit into this kind of situation in the sense that, as in the example I presented in the very beginning of this talk, there could be different principles that guide us and we think are kind of at the core of our values and can guide our decisions. And these forces not only can raise multiplicity, but they can also shape it. And so we can witness like norms evolving, and as Jacob so nicely put, intergenerational transmission of norms can lead to a lot of changes. Like you may not be familiar with this picture. This comes from Arlington, Virginia, 1957, and the lady in the front is a prominent member of the NAACP chapter in Arlington. This white lady tried to convince the principal of this white-only high school to admit 3 African-American children. Unfortunately, she failed. It took another 2 years to desegregate schools in Virginia, one of the staunchest opposers of the desegregation rules. And but that doesn't like that there weren't actually supporters within the white population of desegregation. It's just that was like a small fraction, a small minority, especially in these states. But that doesn't like what resulted after desegregation was that we actually witnessed change of like minority position becoming a majoritarian position. Nowadays, I guess that it will be a very small fraction of people who will still argue for keeping like to reinstate segregation in U.S. schools. At the same time, we cannot witness some groups trying to erase normative principles from other groups, especially if they are somewhat included within the larger group. An example that comes to mind for me is the Ainu people in the Hokkaido island in Japan. Ainu were for long discriminated for their cultures and practices. And this is a concord. It's actually a traditional musical instrument. And the Ainu were forbidden, especially the women, to use and to apply ritual tattoos, which were very evident on women's faces. And they were considered inappropriate, and rules by the ruling Japanese government made it illegal in the middle of the 19th century. And there were a lot of discrimination throughout the also the last century to assimilate and eradicate all sorts of expression of practices and norms by the Ainu people. At the same time, we can see like norm could stem from a similar point, and then groups just drift apart to the point which it's just like group belonging that defines your appropriateness, right? And I'll give you an example. Well, we talk about popularization of the US a lot. I'll try to use another example, which I think is kind of striking, which is Laestadianism, which is a formal Lutheran revival movement in pretty much practices in Scandinavia, but also there's a few chapters in the US as well. So Laestadians are at some point split into different congregations, and the 2 major groups were conservative Laestadianists and firstborn Laestadianists. And as much as these 2 groups share almost exactly the same doctrine, they ended up excluding each other from the kingdom of heaven just because of the way they call themselves. And so the fact that they just call themselves conservatives and firstborn was the only sole factor that deemed them inappropriate, so unworthy of the reaching the God's place. And lastly, norms can evolve in a way that they can just find a sort of an equilibrium, right? And so it's such a way that we reach a level of stability, and in which like multiple norms can exist and there's some sort of harmony, or at least non-aggression. Okay. Now, like I've given you an overview, which is very broad, and I'll give you some anecdotes and examples, but I'd like to tell you one thing I think it's very important, is that this is not a vague concept. We can actually quantify, we can measure multiplicity, and I want to show you how to do it. And after that, I'll move to how we actually do this in the lab, how we do this, how we study this, and a few examples. But first, let me start with how we actually measure multiplicity. I will focus on injunctive norms, but you see why, because we're mostly interested. This kind of approach, it's the hardest when we're talking about descriptives, but we'll talk about descriptives later. So to talk about how do we measure norm multiplicity, I'll have to first give you a few terms. So like the way we can call norms, we can actually have like a very vague understanding. Or there's plenty of definitions, and Christina Vicarius, I think, is probably brought one of the most compelling ones. But I think also it helps to have some sort of quantitative understanding of norms. And one way in which we understand norms is through a graphical representation. And that's something nothing new, that like you probably have seen a lot of papers trying to represent norms in terms of like the appropriate degree of appropriateness. That's a paper from the 1960s that shows exactly this approach. And I think that's something that I like to stick here to express what norms are in a way that it's kind of intuitive. And we know like each action is somewhat mapped into some degree of appropriateness. But also, since we're talking about multiplicity, we're not expecting to have a single norm or norm profile, but we actually have several. So here's an example from a paper from a few years back from like respondents where they were asked to they were asked to predict what kind of norms existed in the dictator game, and you can see there's plenty of patterns, a few recurring patterns. Of course, you can see generosity norm, of course the equity norm, and I think there's also a few weird shapes, a few norm profiles that don't comply, like a selfishness norm if you look into it, and or everything goes norm, and so on. So all of these kind of compounds into the norm landscape that kind of creates the overall society. And lastly, but not less importantly, we have to know like how much do these norms weigh within the group, right? So we need to know how many people subscribe to each kind of point of view. And so these are the kind of three concepts I will be building on from this point on. I just want to stress one important thing. Why is it so useful to think of norms in terms of profile, so mapping multiple actions in terms of appropriateness instead of thinking of single action? And I'd like to give you an example about this. Think about like two hypothetical worlds in which people are divided. Well, the first world, everyone thinks like it's either thinking that there's either blowing your nose or sniffing, it's actually appropriate, or that both are inappropriate. So in other words, you should probably hide yourself if you like sneezing. And another world in which instead a group thinks that blowing the nose is the only appropriate way of dealing with sneezing, and another group thinks that's only sniffing the right way. Now, if you look only at single actions, so thinking about blowing your nose or sniffing your nose, these two worlds are identical. In other words, if you only concentrate on single action, you might miss a lot of information. Having a map, having a norm profile, makes sure we can understand information into more joint manner. So having norm profiles allows us to understand, like looking at an action, we can inform us about other actions. Okay, and let me also show you graphically how all this adds up to. First of all, we have a norm profile. So here is a very basic example with two actions. Let's say that everyone agrees in this case there's no multiplicity, and both actions in this world are neither appropriate nor inappropriate. In other words, nobody will call you out for carrying out any of these two actions or reward you for doing them. And this norm profile can be represented on a Cartesian plane. In this case, well, we have two actions, so it's just a plane. And what we can see is this basically we can map different norms in different coordinates of this landscape. So the landscape is basically a map. And the last thing that's missing, of course, is the population share. So how many people do comply to a given norm? And we can express this to, in this case, that's just a convention, of course, it's true size of the actual, group. Okay, now that we have all this information, we can do a lot of things with this. Like we can represent multiplicity, and we can see that multiplicity, as I expressed in the various examples I said before, comes in different forms. For instance, we can see there's a very strong, like multiplicity, kind of multiplicity. I call it height in a kind of different sense that you might think of, but it kind of makes sense if you see it, which is when two groups have very opposing normative views, right? And now you could call it polarization, for instance. And you can see the norm profiles are basically kind of polar opposites. At the same time, you can represent multiplicity in a more, agreeable way when two groups are somewhat disagreeing, but there's no such stark contrast between them. So I would call this our multiplicity more pluralism. So like people have different views, but they wouldn't feel strongly about deviation from the norm. Okay, and an interesting thing about this, you can actually see how much polarization there is just by looking at the underlying area compared like to the midline of the neither appropriate or inappropriate. So the more they overlap these areas, the more loose is multiplicity. But up to a point in which there's only one group, and at that point there's overlap, complete overlap. Okay, but there's also other flavors of multiplicity. Well, I've just shown you examples where there's clear, complete symmetry, but that doesn't have to be the case, of course. You can have minorities. And that's very important for what I said before. Like, minorities can become majorities, they can disappear. There's all sorts of different ways in which this multiplicity can come into play. And all of this, it's through a dynamic and evolution through time, through generations. And all of this, and that's what I'm saying, is like, we can represent this, we can quantify it, we can actually have measures of this. So I wouldn't delve into much into details because I'd like to present you more stuff, but I'll just show you briefly. There's measures you can quantify through this process, how extreme this multiplicity is, if it maps into total polarization or it's more like a pluralism kind of scenario. I wouldn't go too much into the detail. We can measure through formulas that come from how to measure monopolies, how asymmetric this multiplicity is, right? So if there is a variety of different groups that somewhat have the same size, or if there's a larger group that can fix the biggest share, we can measure how extreme they are compared to having neither sense of like being appropriate or inappropriate action. So. And of course, you can compare different landscapes, which comes in handy because you can, for instance, ask people to predict the norm landscape and then measure it, comparing against the actual norm landscape. You can measure through other measures, right? So you can have all sorts of ways to quantify and measure norms. So to summarize, norm multiplicity can arise. This I'm into summary. No, not done. But almost, can arise under various circumstances, including like horizontal dynamics, vertical dynamics. There's novelty, there's uncertainty. Minorities can become prevalent, can disappear, and multiplicity can tighten, can loosen. But most importantly, we have tools to measure this and to study this more quantitatively. So the way we actually do this in practice, though, there's plenty of ways. We can think of how much am I doing on time, just to know if like also I have to skip a few slides or not. Can you tell me more or less? Or I'll just continue. Okay, let me know whenever it's like I'm hitting like 5 minutes or something like that. So there's plenty of ways to actually capture multiplicity. Like you can see through like the actual descriptive norms and through injunctive norms. So descriptive norms are probably the easiest. we can observe behavior and see how people are going. Here's an example about meat alternatives versus meat. And you can see like a vast majority of US buyers they're all in for meat. They will never eat meat alternatives, never even consider it. A fraction of these people will actually, will be okay with both. And of course, we have vegetarians and the vegans who compose the smallest share and will buy only meat alternatives, right? So all this is like a way of representing, like actually capturing multiplicity that can be done through behavior. Of course, you can also capture descriptive multiplicity through expectations. So here's an example. This is a task developed by Demand a couple of years ago, which basically it asks people to predict how many people in an experiment will perform specific action. And so they basically build a distribution of the population of like how would they fit into each action. So there's many ways to measure descriptive multiplicity. On the other hand, injunctive multiplicity has there's no like objective reference point. Harder to get to what exactly is the actual amount of multiplicity, and therefore you have to rely on Pythagorean expectations. But there's still a few ways to deal with this. You can, for instance, use surveys and polls as proxies. Like here's again meat restrictions and diets in India, for instance. So you can see what people report about like the appropriateness of eating meat. And there's like a few, like distinctions, like, there's full vegetarians, those who only like abstain to eating meat on some Sundays, etc., etc. That, of course, could be only personal preferences, but you can argue they could be somewhat mapping into, religious beliefs and normative beliefs as well. And of course, if you know the groups that compose the population, if you know exactly there's like these and that group, based on political preferences or religious affiliation, etc. Well, you could just use like standard approaches to norm elicitation within each group, and you'd know that I have specific norm within each. But then there's a catch. Of course, you don't always have a clear understanding of what are the groups in the population, right? So it's not always obvious how the population is actually divided on a specific issue. Like then again, think of like situations where there's like a whole shift, right? Like a new event coming and people aren't necessarily not aligning on previous group affiliations to decide on what's appropriate or not. And therefore, that's why we devised together with my colleagues this norm drawing task, which is basically a way I'll show you. It's basically people are asked to draw norm profiles like they think exist in a population. Here's an example about wind power in Italy, right? So you're thinking like, is it good or bad to build wind farms, or is it appropriate or inappropriate to build them close to places like that are in my vicinity? And participants are like somewhat predicting what kind of norm profiles exist, and then they are asked what share of the population endorse each norm. Okay, I'll have this to recap to what I just said. So there's a first kind of a prediction of the norm profile, and then there's an estimation of how many people endorse it. And what I think it's kind of nice about this task is not only we can get a good estimate of what kind of norms could exist in a population without having to define the groups that are within them. It's the participants themselves who think like there's three groups and like there's three kinds of people in the world. There's four kinds of people in the world, etc., right? And that's a nice feature. Another nice feature is that it's pretty flexible in many ways. The way we've implemented this in our studies is through coordination-based incentives. So in other words, we can pay participants by like the closer they get to other people's predictions. And there's a method for that. I can show you the plot supplementary if you're curious. But of course, we can use this through just like sequential opinion. So we ask first like each person's norms and principles, and then ask to predict what others have said. So that's one way of like dealing with this. And of course, there's another another feature which I think it's interesting is that you don't have to be restrained to having like 3 levels, 4 levels, whatever. You can make responses even like you can have degrees of appropriateness or degrees of inappropriateness if you want, and you can all the metrics I've shown you before will apply anyways. So you can measure the more fine-grained levels of appropriateness if you think there's necessary. Okay. Again, I'm not sure how much I have, like 5 minutes. Anyone can help me out with that? No, I'll just go.
You still have
Okay.
about 15 minutes.
Oh, that's great. That's great. No, I didn't want to eat any time from the Q&A if there's anyone interested. Okay. So let me just give you a few examples from my research I think will be kind of interesting. That somewhat use multiplicity either as a phenomenon itself to be studied or have multiplicity as somewhat of a predictor of other factors. Okay, so one thing I've showed you before is like we can, for instance, measure expectations, normative expectations in the population through for instance, like opinion polling. It would be nice to see if actually our task somewhat matches what is going on in if like so can we recover different different group norms through the norm drawing task, and that's what we set out to do, and that's something we did last year on a paper where basically we had a separate group of people like in the US register leaning Republicans and Democrats, and we elicited norms within these two groups, and that's kind of the result. This is an example. We asked them about a lot of policies. This is the example on same-sex rights. You can see there's quite a stark difference in terms of the average norm within the two groups. The question then is like, can we use the NDT? Like we ask a sample from the US, again, representative sample, and can these US participants predict these two norms in a way? So what we did is we asked them through the NDT to predict what kind of norms within the US population, but we didn't tell anyone to actually, we never mentioned either Democrats or Republicans. So they had to figure it out themselves, right? And the results, at least to us, convinced us that yes, actually can kind of recover groups without explicitly naming them. So of the norms in like the norm profiles that are represented the most in the norm drawing task, these are the 3 most common. And you can see there's clearly like, well, there's some mapping, at least I will arguably, there's some mapping. You can think that the first view is actually belonging to Democrats and the second and third view more in line with the Republicans. And what's nice, what's neat is that you can see it actually mapped quite nicely in terms of share. So the average share of the first view is around 40%, and the sum of the second and the third most common norms in the norm drawing task sum up to 41.5%. So we can see there's kind of a indirect representation of Democrats and Republicans, even if we never actually named them. And we tried to see if this actually occurs in different policies, and we had like 7 different policies. And generally, the level of prediction we use, like an actually quantitative measure to see how much the norms of Republicans and Democrats were reproduced within the norm drawing task, and we see there is quite an overlap. And in fact, there's quite a strong ability of like US participants to predict Republicans and Democrats norms. But one thing we noticed, you can see that maybe you will argue that that's kind of a stretch to say that these 2 norms are exactly the kind of composition of the norm of Republicans. In fact, it looks like there's way more people who are opposing same-sex rights in the norm drawing task. And actually, I recently took up this data again because I was views. And it turns out that Republicans in particular, when we take only the Republican share of people predicting, what Republicans do, they tend to overestimate conservatism within the party and within the data we collected. That's an example here again. Here are the norm landscapes, the actual norm landscape of like personal views of Republicans in our experiment, and the predictions, the norm landscape that it's basically derived from the norm drawing task. And you can see one thing you can see is like, this is example for marijuana legalization. And you can see me, I can show you like one policy at a time. You can see, for instance, that medical use, the prediction is that the Republicans are not so considering like medical use as appropriate compared to actual views of Republicans. And recreational use, the views are even starker. Like there's an estimate of like in the norm drawing task, Republicans think that there's only 20% agreement to use marijuana for recreational use, whereas it's almost 50% in the actual numbers of people who actually express their own opinion on this. So, and if we actually try and see, can we use like Republicans' predictions to predict personal views of Republicans? It's actually really bad. Like answering at random, it's actually better than using Republicans' predictions in the norm drawing task. And this is true for almost all the policies that we've tested. So kind of there's a clear mismatch between what Republicans, think of their party and what they actually say. And you might ask, how do Democrats score? And that's the thing, that Democrats are way better at predicting the views within their party. In a way that it's actually quite a large gap, it's like around 15% of like the maximum gap that's possible. So it's actually a good chunk of like the maximum variance that you could get. And so I think that was an interesting way of like applying norm drawing task and see how much the different subgroups are good at predicting views within and outside their party. Here's another example. This is from more recent research we conducted around election day last year. And we have used the norm drawing task in this case to measure normative views on anti-democratic behavior, like refusing to accept the election outcome when the outgroup party wins, or physically attacking a person from the outgroup party, prohibiting protesting for certain groups, etc. And in this experiment, we used we allowed participants to rate appropriateness on a continuous scale, so we can see a lot of more variability in this case, the way people respond. But just to simplify things a bit, we clustered responses, and the three most like common norms that kind of came out have this sort of shape, and where the first group basically and the most popular group according to our participants' prediction is that all these kind of anti-democratic behavior is pretty much inappropriate. There's a second view that condones like the refusing the election outcome action. So it's kind of like it's appropriate because for reasons. And there's a smaller group that it's still consistently reported, which actually it's believed to support all anti-democratic practices. So in other words, when people are asked like about how is the population, U.S. population divided on anti-democratic behavior, a lot of people consistently report that a fraction of people is actually okay with all this behavior. And I was interested in looking into whether like what's the kind of news diet of these people. And we had a few questions related to this. And after like we did some analysis, and one interesting predictor of reporting this third cluster, was the fact that people who actually got news on social media. So if you report in the experiment that you actually got your news on social media, you were more likely to report the existence of these people. the norm drawing task. Okay. I probably would like to spend a few minutes on the actual task. I want to show you a few things, so maybe I would like to skip this if we have like another 5 minutes or so. And I'll go directly because there's another example. This comes from another paper, but why I think it's I spoke so long, but I'd like to show you actually that this thing is actually online. You can use it if you're curious and you want to try it out. And I think that's kind of the kind of point of like to share, to make this reproducible and to have other people, have it for their own questions. So here is the actual repository, and there's a QR code where you can directly access. There is currently the task, the norm drawing task, is only available for Qualtrics. So I was thinking of having like coding the version in Tally or being available for other survey programs. But so far, we have to make do in Qualtrics, and I'd like to share the actual version of I have. Like, this is a tutorial. I hope you can see my screen. Let me just put it full screen so you can probably see better. And here is how it looks when you actually take the QSF file, so the Qualtrics file, and you upload it on your own Qualtrics account. And what you see is basically it's a precompiled survey, but it contains like a few more extras. You have the instructions. There's a tutorial where people are forced to learn the task. They cannot proceed without knowing how it works. And so it's rather intuitive. I didn't have many people actually complaining because I read all the comments of participants, and they generally are okay with the kind of response format. And but still, there's a kind of a compulsory instructions. They have like few answers they have to give to show that they understood the task. And after that, there's the actual task, which is it's pretty much customizable. The most features can be actually edited inside the survey flow. So if you actually click here, you will see there's a few variables that you can change. For instance, you can just define how many norms they can draw. Like, you can set a limit. I will strongly advise for that, because a few people like to be very precise and draw all sorts of combinations of norms. But I generally set this to a limit. But we can argue about this. We can discuss about this, because that's one of the things that was like there's different opinions on. And you can decide how many different actions to evaluate. So you have like you want to map like a norm profile on 2 actions, or in your case, like you have 3, 4, 5 different actions. All of this can be adjusted, and you can of course label the different actions. You give them different names, and etc. So it's rather customizable. You also, there's an extra task in the end, which is definitely not like part of this presentation, but I think it's an interesting feature, is that once people draw in the norm drawing task different norms they think they exist, they can also decide how to express their support for one or multiple. Okay. Yeah. So that being said, I think I guess I already spent a lot of time on talking, and there's a few recommendations, but I think it's most important to actually thank my co-authors who helped me so much in the process and development of these measures. I see there's Christina with the hand raised. I guess it was related to the Qualtrics. I don't know if we want to, yes, like it's a clarification question or anything Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Very interesting talk. I know your work.
Thank you.
I have two questions. One is very general. You seem to be, when you measure appropriate, and I'm coming to that, you seem to be measuring evaluations, values. You're not really measuring whether people are prepared to act on those values or not. So you have to be very clear, because a norm is a norm because then we act on it. Okay, that's my definition, but it's important to keep the empirical component in mind, because I value X, but then I don't behave as if I value X, etc. So it's very important, especially for polarization. But apart from that, there is something that I'm thinking about a lot these days, and is how much language matters. And instead, I am commenting on Valerio Capraro's book. I don't know if you know his new book, which is very interesting, which is about basically, we know in behavioral economics that how you describe, an experiment in different way will lead to very different behavior, etc. And the question is, do we have a sort of more analytical view about how much language matters, which ways, etc. And thinking about appropriate, in the experiment that you show at the very end, you tell them how to interpret it. But I think it's very interesting. I have an experiment published with my graduate student, Jeannie Kwang, on how the interpretation of these evaluative terms, it can be appropriate, right, moral, good, mandatory, okay, permissible, etc., how they don't make a difference with very strong norms like reciprocity, but they make an enormous difference with weaker norms like donation to a charity, okay? And I wonder if you have thought, instead of using appropriate, now in the last example, you give people, a definition, say moral, ethical, okay? But appropriate maybe is okay. I don't think is particularly right, but I think is okay, etc., etc. And so I think in the case that you study, multiplicity of norms with polarization or different type of aggregation or disaggregation of these norms, when you analyze that, the precision in the language is very important. Also because it will tell you how strong these evaluations are. So how strong the norm, if you want to call it a norm, is versus how weak it is and easy to change. So this is a very general question, but I think it's very important because appropriate has been used, very widely and has to be, I think, thought about.
Thank you very much, Christina. I couldn't agree more. You touched on 2 points. I was until the very last minute uncertain where to include in the slides or not. And to touch on the first point, does expectation, does evaluation map into behavior? And we do have some evidence of that, in the sense that we can see how it follows from their beliefs in terms of the non-growing task, how they behave in third-party punishment. So not by just acting themselves, because there could be a lot of concern, and but how would they actually monetarily punish or reward someone who endorses or not endorses, and the behavior they think it's appropriate. So if there's a lot of multiplicity, we see the connection between moral principles and actions watered down. So I know there's a lot of different points of view, and I would enact less. And if instead I'm convinced that there's only one moral principle we should fight with, and that's it, then my third party punishment will be way stronger. So that's one thing. But we're definitely just tapping and like scratching the surface of how much we can actually map entity and so like norm multiplicity with behavior. About language, I totally agree. I first I thought of like, should we use appropriate or inappropriate in our tasks? And I thought, like, well, just for continuity. But I would advocate like we need to be very careful with the wording, and I think it really should be used on a case by case, depending on what is also the common intuition, and also this taps into like one of the things that that's also another important issue is like what constitutes a norm profile. So like what are the actions that are somewhat marking the existence of a norm? What are the important behaviors that are somewhat evaluated? Because you could narrow it down to just a few behaviors, but maybe there's a lot. Depends. Like, it's like a religious doctrine will come down to one thing, or it could be a lot, right? And at the same time, what's the metric that you're using? Should be appropriate, should be moral, should be, expectation, and all of these should be defined in the first place. You need to do some qualitative evaluations first to do this properly in a quantitative fashion. So all these measuring work best if you know the words that the people speak in this kind of context. And I don't have like an exact answer to how to do it, but I think that's definitely necessary, and I think that's one way to move forward in this.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there other questions? I don't want to polarize. Actually, there is a question. Angela?
I was about to raise my hand, but I wanted to wait first if someone else will step up. So I wrote actually a couple of questions in the chat, but maybe we can start with my first one, and then if others still don't have questions, we can move to my second one. So my first question is, well, first, I find the norm drawing task really, really interesting and very exciting way to capture a lot of different information actually about the norm multiplicity. But since you mentioned in the start of your presentation that the sources of multiplicity, for example, could come from different sources like group dynamics or uncertainty, I was wondering if the norm drawing task could also capture information about this. So if you find that effectively there is norm multiplicity, whether you can get an idea of where it comes from, for example, by asking people how certain they are about their answers. This just made me think, for example, in the example you shared about this result of Republicans overestimating conservatives within their party, I think it's very different if they are really sure of their answer and then they find out they are wrong and they are very surprised. It's very different from them already, maybe since the beginning, acknowledging that they are actually not so sure. So if they are mistaken, maybe it doesn't come so much as a surprise. So this will be a way, same for group dynamics, since people need to already draw the different norm profiles and how many people may pertain to every norm profile, whether you can ask information about who do you think are those belonging on these different norm profiles. That's my question.
Thank you, Angela. That's a great suggestion. We've thought about introducing uncertainty in this task, and I think that'd be spot on, especially in this case. I mean, my interpretation of this is slightly different in the sense that what your stance on specific policies matters way less for Republicans than Democrats, and so that could explain part of uncertainty. And I definitely think there's many ways you can measure uncertainty. You can use self-report. You can measure it indirectly by comparing responses to like other kinds of metrics from objective behavior. And including some degree of uncertainty in the norm drawing task is actually absolutely possible. But to make if you want to, I think, have the best approach, I mean, you can make it also uncertainty elicitation incentive compatible. But I think we'll get to a point in which the participant gets lost in the in the process of understanding that thing. So I think the best approach would be just simple self-report. But it's definitely on our to-do list and the research project is to actually map how much uncertainty taps into multiplicity in the joint cup. That's a great point. Thank you. I don't know if you want to follow up with the second question, or we have Wei on.
We can move to Wei, and then afterwards, if there is time, I can ask my second question.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm sorry that my computer reacts very slowly. Great presentation. Thank you so much, especially the multi-dimensional way to approach norm study is just very eye-opening to me. I'm not very familiar with your work yet. Just one question. Thinking about my previous experiences in Kosovo, I did a quick ground study in Kosovo to see what kind of normative expectation, empirical expectation is about the minority and the majority Kosovians regarding their long-lasting conflict with the Serbians. So in Kosovo, there's a majority Albanian residents and also minority Serbian residents. One observation I had was that because the norm enforcer, which usually is the older generation in their own family, they have a so strong influence, really in line with the Christina's study about the reference point in norm compliance kind of behavior, is that younger generations hearing stories that from their older generation that what happened 20 years ago, and then that actually affect their economic choice, whether engage or not engage with the other groups, even though the economic exchange certainly is beneficial to both. So I know that this probably should belong to a very small, very extreme type of norm or norm studies, but since it is such a important and also very costly situation to the society, I wonder your work either currently or in the future would touch that direction. In nutshell, is how to address that norm influencers rule in shaping the society's norm.
Okay, so if I like just to rephrase here so I understand correctly, like how much can we somewhat understand norms through our like parents and great parents, and that how does that shape the direction of more dynamics? So it's a sort of like how can we study norm learning? Is that the question in a way?
Yes, and then I
Okay.
would say that I'm just thinking that the norms, they are not all horizontally or vertically weighted equally. Certainly, there's just giving a ordinary person from Kosovo their day-to-day lives. Probably in every day, multiple norms applies to a different situation.
Yeah.
So some norms may be easier to change or establish, for example, recycling. But some other norms, how to learn, how to interact and live with another group of people in the same country, it seems is a deeply rooted question, and it seems there's what I'm saying is that there's elasticity issue.
Yeah,
in
no, I get it. I
yeah.
get it. Yeah, no, I get it. Yeah, it's definitely. I mean, my interest also lies into how can we have not like a static photography of societies, but actually to see how they evolve, and I definitely that's one of the directions is to see actually how different norms can change and to what degree. I totally agree on the point that certain norms are like there's clear descriptives. There's a lot of information gathered in very frequent updating, and others that are just like a few taboos, for instance, that don't just can't be witnessed very frequently, especially when there's like a very strong polarized society in the first place. Like interaction is forbidden; it doesn't occur that much, and there's a lot of, you know, layers that have to be, like the walls to be broken down. So the process of evolution of these phenomenon is different, and that's interesting. I think it could be somewhat replicated and simulated. And like the first thing to me is actually to study this in a controlled environment, and to see how frequency of the observation, the quality of observation, and the kind of like extremity of the norms involved shape this kind of updating. And I think that would be an interesting direction. Also, I think, and there's some very recent research which actually points to the fact that the way we learn is very selective. As actually you mentioned, family, parents. It really is like there's like such an overweighting of experience. If we may think there's a majority view just because we always observe the same person repeating the same behavior, but if we just look just around the corner, outside our neighbor, there's a lot more variability. So I think also the frequency of the observation doesn't map necessarily to the heterogeneity of observations, right? So it's a lot to count, but yeah.
I think that if you pick one focal point, which if I pick, I would pick reference points. Actually, Christina has this interesting suggestion about the social preferences is never stable. It's regard the context you're in, and then who is your reference point. In any regards, you're talking about one person's perspective of different norms, normative or empirical. However, each time when you ask a question, put the person in the thinking path, I think he probably or she unintentionally was thinking their reference point. So
yeah,
so that is probably this is some subject you're studying, but it's one subject could have different reference points. So that could be the undercutting dimension.
Yeah, and that also taps into the language ambiguity that also,
Language is a big issue.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, especially when you mentioned about the new norm appearing, thinking about in the environment that the economic sectors are changing, especially with the AIs introducing to the society, regulations are going to change a lot. And then regulated entity are going to respond based on their best ability to interpret. And then there's a new norm going to be established, such and such. But if regulatory text itself is ambiguous, because the lawmakers also don't know what is going to happen, society is up to their own liberty to interpret what kind of rule, behavior rule they should follow. So just thinking about the self-selective reference points is going to be very important.
Sorry to interrupt, but we are actually past the time. So thank you so much for your contribution, Weiwei. I think we should continue maybe this discussion over email. Again, thank you both
very much
for joining today. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Folco.